The Museum of Contemporary Art Denver presents Practicing Citizenship, a conversation series featuring artists, activists, and experts exploring civic engagement. Tonight, we bring you Yumi Roth and Lincoln Bramwell on property rights and public lands. And now, here's Sarah Bai, MCA Denver's Director of Programming.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Bai. I'm the Director of Programming at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, and this is Practicing Citizenship, the program series MCA Denver is producing in conjunction with the exhibition Citizenship, A Practice of Society, which is on view now at the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver. We come to you live every Wednesday night throughout the run of the exhibition. And tonight we are presenting a conversation on property rights and public lands. I'm joined tonight by artist Yumi Roth and National Forest historian Lincoln Bramwell. I'll introduce Yumi and Lincoln in a moment, but first, this conversation was inspired by Yumi Roth's work, Property Rights, which is currently on view as a part of Citizenship, A Practice of Society. This work is a series of 5 signs of the artist's making, which she'll show you later, and the signs hew very closely to the design and wording of actual national park signage installed in the Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado. The land is managed by the Forest Service, which is a part of the United States Department of Agriculture, and this federally owned land is accessible to people for recreational use and in some cases low-impact agricultural and natural resource extraction. And those uses are what Yumi's project in this conversation tonight are going to explore in more depth. We are so honored to present this conversation. We're glad you're tuning in, and we invite you to be a part of the discussion. However, it takes a lot to bring you this programming. If you have the means, please consider donating to support MCA Denver. We're going to put up a link in the chat. We suggest a donation of $10, which is what we would normally have charged for tickets for programming in the before times. But of course, any amount helps. And thank you for your support. As questions come up throughout the talk tonight, you can type them in the chats or save them for the end. As always, we want to hear your voice, and we want this community to be a respectful and welcome place for conversation. So please keep it clean in the comments. And now it's my honor to introduce Yumi and Lincoln. Yumi is a professor of sculpture and post-studio practice at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she lives. As an artist, her body of work explores immigration, hybridity, and displacement through discrete objects and site-responsive installations, which have been exhibited nationally and internationally. Lincoln is the agency historian at the United States Forest Service, where he leads a team who is writing a book on the history of American agriculture and the role of forest conservation, as well as research and writing about key legislative acts, court decisions, and agency directives that have impacted Forest Service management today. Please welcome Yumi and Lincoln.
Hi, Lincoln.
Hey, Yumi, how are you?
Great. Here we are in our little Zoomiverse, or the MCA's version of Zoomiverse. I'm excited to get to talk to you. When I was asked to participate in this show, and they were, and I was sort of describing the project, and then they were building out sort of the public programming. One of the things that when they asked me who I would want to talk to, I started researching, and I discovered that the chief historian of the Forest Service lived in Colorado. And I was really excited by that because now you've come to know this, but my dad was the chief historian in the 1980s of the Forest Service when we were living outside of Washington, D.C. So I feel like there's a kind of nice circling around.
Absolutely, and I am so grateful for the invitation and really excited. I mean, it's not often that I get to talk with people that have thought so deeply about something as esoteric as property rights and what you can and can't do on federal lands and how that works out. So I'm just absolutely tickled, and thanks.
Great. So what I thought I'd do first is I was just going to show some images from the project, and then also the installation that I did at the MCA, and then we can kind of we'll just kind of go from there. So maybe I could show the slides. That'd be great. Thanks. So oops. I actually am on the last slide somehow. Oops. Let's see if I can get back. Okay, sorry about that. A little technical difficulty. So, and this is great because I can share these images also with you, Lincoln. So the project started. I'd come across some reading about sort of community property or the idea of the commons, and it made me think about just all the federal land in the West, just because there's so much of it. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's like upwards of 50% of the Western United States is managed by the federal government in some agency or another. So I was really curious about that because, when we think of sort of national forests and national parks, we just think of sort of expansive land, and we don't think about the kinds of rights that govern them, or at least a lot of people don't. I think there are other people who do think about the specific things that they can do on that land, but that's not always the general understanding. So this is one of the signs that I installed. I just had some municipal signs made, and I put that language up of the different types of rights, of management rights and extraction rights and exclusion rights, alienation rights, and access rights. And they, and you'll do a better job explaining this than me, but they sort of map out the different ways people have access or are able to do things on certain kinds of land. So this is just a picture, and it was like really helpful for me to sort of visualize just how much of the Western United States is really overseen by the federal government. And I highlighted 4 of the major agencies, but there are many more agencies that actually manage land. So in Colorado, a lot of the federal land is Forest Service land, which I didn't realize, but it makes sense. And then there's also BLM land, the Bureau of Land Management, which is, mostly Nevada and Utah, and National Park Service land, which is things like Estes Park, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. Those are it seems like the major agencies or that sort of oversee the largest chunks, but there are others. And so these are sort of other iterations. So this is every time I kind of joked that, I put these signs up wherever I found posts that were sort of owned by the federal government. And so I just started kind of going wherever I could throughout the Roosevelt National Forest and sort of and installing these signs and leaving them behind. Here's a couple others. And then this is, kind of a Forest Service access road. And here's all of the types of rights sort of explained there. I like this one just because there were hikers kind of going back and forth, and some of them didn't notice the signs, but at some point somebody did notice the signs and pointed to their companion and wondered, oh, are these new signs? Which I thought was kind of interesting. And then, the project, when I thought about it as something like out in the, kind of out in the world. I didn't necessarily have initially a vision for how I would bring it back into a museum. And part of it had lined up in the sort of the COVID times. And so going back into indoor space wasn't clear at the times, but going out into the forest seemed really easy. But then I started imagining, okay, once the museum exhibition came up, like, okay, well, how am I going to reimagine this for an interior space? And so I started thinking about the architectural objects that sort of exist in those spaces. So all of these types of map kiosks, for example, or information kiosks. And I love sort of the mixture of images or signs that are on those information boards and fee stations and whatnot. And then also what I was thinking about is, I mentioned it early on, is my dad was the chief historian of the Forest Service back in the 80s, and his area of research was the wilderness movement and the Wilderness Act of 1964, and just Forest Service history in general. And the Forest Service and the USDA had always been a part of my upbringing, but it wasn't until this project that I actually started to think about it sort of more closely again. So I decided to, and here's my family. Here's us in the circa 1979 or 1980. These are the mountains down in Colorado Springs, not in the Northern Rockies, but nonetheless. But I decided to kind of, try to bring the project together, bring some of that writing from my dad, because he does talk about sort of the competing interests on public land, and then bring that with some of the images and objects in the museum. And so I thought it would be an interesting way to sort of bring Forest Service history and then sort of public art intervention into a shared space. And so here are some of the takeaways. If you go to the museum, you can get one of these. And then I was thinking about sort of the kind of didactic setups that places like the Park Service do to kind of inform the public about, kind of the history of a site. So this is just sort of an image I picked up in terms of, and it's, instead of a photograph, it's a series of illustrations, but you can see they're sort of mural size and large scale, and then there are sort of kind of objects from like that you might associate from the time with that barrel in the foreground. So for the museum, I created that idea of sort of that information center that you might come across with the Park Service or another agency, and then also bringing in that idea of the information kiosk as a way to distribute that in the maps and the text of my dad. So that's the last image, but that kind of gives you a little bit of a survey of the project and how it went from outside to inside. I think that's the last image, and we can go back. Let me go here. Great.
Yeah. So, and I love those images. I mean, for someone that deals with, and spends times on forests and has kind of seen those kiosks and those signs out in the woods. I don't know. It just kind of warms my heart. So, and to see somebody thinking about them deeply. I mean, I think when you had that image of that kind of large kiosk at, say, like a trailhead or a parking lot, what's fascinating is I always kind of crack up about the types of signs that are either like way too wordy, or they're a whole bunch of no's, like don't have a campfire, don't let your dog off, or whatever.
Right.
And I kind of chide people about that sometimes in recreation, about it's either no or you just tell us way too much.
Right.
So I'm fascinated, Yumi, like when you thought, when you conceptualize, like how do you take something that you're thinking about something outside, I mean, the public lands, that's huge. And especially thinking of something so, almost like an intellectual kind of conceptualization of these lands are actually centered around, they're here, or they're in this, they look the way they do because of a certain set of laws and rights. And what was kind of your starting off point of trying to, how do you translate that as a visual artist?
Yeah, I mean, that it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, I've been in Colorado now for a while. So over a decade, almost 20 years. And before I moved here, I'd been coming back and forth because my family, my grandparents had retired to Colorado. So I had known the landscape, but, the way the Western landscape is very different from the Midwest and very different from the East Coast, right? And sort of the way in which we think about our access to that land, like what we can do on it. It feels like, back east that a lot of land is much more like you get a much clearer sense of private land, what is private and what you can't go onto. Yeah. Whereas land in the West, there's a lot more public land, and your ability to cross those boundaries seems much easier, right? Sometimes you're like, oh, am I allowed to go down that road, or am I not allowed to go? Am I allowed to extract this? Can I take wood out from it? Can I pick these flowers? Can I take these rocks, or can I not? And so I've always been interested in those kinds of questions because, going back to my dad, I was always really sensitive about what I could or couldn't do on public land. Like I always, and on certain kinds of public land, I was supposed to be a good citizen on public land. But I kind of was thinking about that with this project. And then I had been, like I said, sort of just thinking about this idea of the commons and like this idea of like, are the commons always, is material and sort of resources always extracted to, in a negative way from it. I was reading some economists who were also talking about that. And then I came across this language, these different kinds of rights. I sort of just stumbled on it, honestly. It's not like I had a specific, like I knew them in the beginning. But when I came across them and I came across the definitions, and they were divorced from the public lands, I wondered what would happen if I I tried to place them in the public land, and I was trying to think of different formats. And again, it was like going back and thinking, well, what already exists in those spaces? Well, signage, right? What does that signage look like? And usually the kind of signage, like you're saying, that like it either tells you what you can do and what you can't do, are those standard municipal metal signs, that are durable to the weather, and you understand them without even knowing what they say. They're telling you that you can or can't do something that's already sort of built into the object. So I wondered then, like, if I placed that language onto those signs that you already have an expectation, and then just really started littering them to some extent in the national forest, kind of what would our relationship to that space become? Because they pose a question more than anything. Because if you come across a sign that says, access rights, I'm like looking at, I have some extras here, and it says like the right to enter an area and enjoy no, subtractive benefits. So I can't mine, I can't pull any wood out, but I can enjoy it. I can go take a hike. All of a sudden you're like, well, does that right apply to me? Does it apply to everybody? If you come across another sign that's really, that's about extraction, and you go, oh, okay, is that, you wonder again, is that my right? Do I have a right to do that? So what I was interested in is that somebody might come across these different signs and wonder if the right applied to them, or if it applied to somebody else, or if it was just a general right being expressed, So that was the first part. That's kind of the long answer for the first part. And it was just fun going around, like, screwing signs onto signposts, and kind of looking official, but not totally. But then, then there's this other part where you have to try to reconcile it in a museum type of space, and that's where I became interested in sort of that, the certain kind of photography that you associate with, those kinds of information centers at the national park, like something that you could scale really big, that felt like almost a 1-to-1 scale with the human body. So it's as if you had encountered it in space, but it's a photograph, and it's sort of a real, like a life-size diorama, So I'm also trying to tap into sort of that memory of those types of sort of public spaces, like federal spaces.
Oh, that's fascinating. No, I mean, that's tremendous. I mean, that idea of you put a sign that makes people ask a question or think about it. It's like the polar opposite of what you want to happen with a sign. I'm like, I don't want ambiguity. I don't want to take an action, either stop your action or continue your action.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Road is closed.
Exactly. I mean, the funny thing is, when I installed a bunch of signs over where I put a whole bunch of them next to sort of that road access, like there was, the road closed. There was the sort of no parking. We're going to tow your vehicle if you park your vehicle here, like all these things that were just telling you absolutely not. And then the language of the visual language of those signs, which participated in that, you can't do it. But if you read them, you were like, oh, wait a minute, these aren't telling me anything I can't do. And that was where I had one of those strange encounters with some folks who were going on a hike. And so they went around the road closure because they could, and they were going to go on their hike. And then one of the hikers actually doubled back and looked up at one of the signposts, and then turned to her partner and said, are these look new? Are these new signs? And they just sort of like look a bit puzzled at them. And then they just kind of kept on their way. But the fact that happened, that there was that moment of something is different in this situation, and maybe, as they were walking on the trail, they started to have a conversation about some of the stuff they read. It was interesting to me. I just looked like a birder in the background.
Yeah, I love that, because I think, as Americans, as American citizens, you are actually a landowner. This is part of your citizenship, is you're a part owner of public lands, and you have a say in how they're managed. And there's, like you said, that map that you had with those different agencies, and there's different public lands are managed for different purposes. Mm-hmm. And say a wildlife refuge versus a a national park visitor center, two very different purposes. And I think it's fascinating how you bring people into, it's like, hey, remember, you are a citizen and you are part of this, and there's a bunch of rights that you have, both as the federal government to manage this, but you have rights that relate to that. It's not just a series of no's.
Right.
But that I love how you do that and kind of process and think about that.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, and like I said, it was also sort of that right kind of project at a time when you just wanted to be outside, like you wanted to be not sort of, kind of hemmed into a space. But one of the things that, and we talked about this a little before, but it'd be interesting to hear your take. I think it's, we talked about how you said that it was sort of like a bit of an epiphany. Oh, we are all landowners, right? We are all landowners just by the mere virtue of the federal government owning all this land. But one thing that would be interesting, I'm kind of curious your perspective. So, how would you describe like the approach to land management, sort of as a historian, like in this current moment, but then also compared with maybe how we've like managed land in the past, and whether that's, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever. I think it'd be kind of interesting, especially, from the historian's perspective.
Sure. Well, that's actually the question that keeps me interested in my job, in my position. Because for me, if you think of like federal lands and public lands and say national forests, that's what I'm most familiar with. Like how they've been managed at any point in time over the past century plus that there've been these types of public lands. Any time in that, or any point in that timeline, it's really a reflection of what Americans are thinking about their natural resources. The origins of public lands in the late 19th century really came out of a period of, there was real anxiety that we were going to run out of or use up valuable resources that we collectively use, like timber. Timber up through the late 19th century was the main construction material and the main energy source to do things like heat homes and build the homes out of. And losing that resource was anxious enough that the federal government actually acted and allowed for this large scale sort of reservation of what they saw as less of, oh, these are pretty places, but more of, this is a vital resource we better hang on to and use sort of judiciously. And so that management, it's kind of ebbed and flowed, where, you think about World War II and post World War II, where, we had these storehouses of national forests, and it was really seen as, hey, this is a time we really need to use some of these resources, both for like the war effort, and just remind people, World War II, tanks and guns were made out of metal, but they were all packed in wooden crates and shipped overseas. And that was a major use. It was a major a war resource. And then the post-World War II housing boom. When I lived in DC, I lived in a house built in like 1952 with, wood from a forest. And then over time, the attitudes and ideas and needs of the nation have changed to where forests now, the main use, just in terms of numbers of people, it's for recreation. We now understand the real impact that forests have on carbon sequestration that help our climate profile as a nation. And you see that kind of that shift over time. I think of it kind of waves, where it sort of undulates. And since the 1990s, just thinking of the Forest Service in particular, we operate under an idea called ecosystem management, which was an executive branch idea that came out of the first Bush presidency, where anything that is going to be managed on or take place on national forests has to think about the ecosystem as a whole, right? And because it's not a law that President Bush helped pass or sign into law, it's more of an executive order. Ever since then, from the 90s, as you've had changing presidential administrations, you have a little bit of a shift of a pendulum from, say, more ecosystem or more management. And sometimes as federal employees and, say, the Forest Service, we get a little bit of a jostling as administrations change. So it's very common to kind of feel that, but our sort of mission as an agency is like, hey, take the long game, think about the forest in long spaces of time. What you do today, what's that impact going to look 20, 50 years down the road, and try to manage expectations that way, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, because it's like, when you think about, when I was, again, sort of revisiting some of that stuff my dad's writing, for example, I was, reading about, I actually remember as a kid, him always talking about sort of the big dramas of the Forest Service, like Forest Service history, like what it meant to actually establish those, that, they were huge competing interests, always kind of fighting each other. And then when I was just kind of rereading this in the context of the project, I was sort of reminded again of sort of, like you've got people who, there are people who believe in the carbon sequestration and sort of environmental preservation. You've got farmers who care about the watershed. You've got, sort of people who want the timber. You've got, mining sort of interests, like all these things. And how do you manage them? And in the context of what he was doing, it was like, how do you carve out a part of the forest and call it wilderness, and nobody touches it, basically. At least that's what my understanding is with wilderness areas, is they're more pristine, and then still allow for all these other activities to happen in other parts of the forest. So those are all the big questions I kept thinking about, and here I am just like kind of putting up my little signs everywhere. But I think that's, for me, that was, it was an interesting, in some ways, it was kind of like a meditative process to think about some of those bigger questions by just putting these smaller questions out there over and over again.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious. I've gone back a couple times and they were still up, but I haven't been back more lately to see if, what sort of exists, what's been sort of perceived as like, oh, that really doesn't belong here, we should remove it.
Or what might have burned.
What might have burned, yeah.
In the last few months, you might have some pretty quick aging on a couple of your signs, maybe.
I know, and I thought about that too. It was, because when I done the project, all of us, like, what is it, within the last month, like 3 fires erupt, basically in the Roosevelt National Forest, to the point that it closed the forest. Like, that's shocking to me. I'd never, that doesn't happen often, does it?
It really doesn't. That was a really dramatic movie. Not too unsimilar to what we've all been experiencing in the pandemic, with shutting down businesses and like, I've never really seen that in my life. And it's kind of, the only time I had seen something like that would be, like a dramatic hurricane where you almost don't have to tell people. It's like, hey, we're done. It's the eye of the hurricane is going to be right over you.
Right.
Get out. It's that kind of closure that was really, really dramatic. Like, I didn't have, the only time I'd seen that in my career was a couple of hurricane events, more in the East related to forests, where it was just get out, get someplace safe.
Right.
It's not safe to be out here.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I remember also looking, because I had been looking at lots of maps also, and, and thinking about the project, and, and then I started looking at it was interesting to look at kind of the Forest Service maps, and then to look at the Forest Service maps with the closures overlaid on them. It just became another kind of way of sort of thinking about that information. So I had that, kind of also like more lately sort of rattling around in the back of my mind, and it made me rethink again those questions. So yeah, if you can do these sorts of things to the land, what are you doing to either accelerate the kinds of things that we just have experienced, or what are you doing to preserve it so these things don't happen, or that they have an effect, right? And that's a super tangible effect. 3 giant forest fires is a super tangible effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what a lot of my work has looked at. And it's a great example to think corollary to your work of property rights and what you can and can't do, is thinking about, in the context of wildfire, you have, you realize when an event hits like that. So there's actually people actually have inholdings within the boundaries of, say, the Roosevelt National Forest, and live there, or have a cabin there, or some kind of recreational retreat or something, or they live right on the boundary lines, to
right.
where an event like this is where a fire is, it can impact them. Their houses are kind of, I was describing as like, chocolate chips sprinkled in cookie dough. They're in the forest, and the fire doesn't respect the boundaries of the forest, but it brings up all those questions like, well, do you have a right to live there? Yeah. Are there access questions? Are there, issues of management and the right to manage these lands? Well, yes. And it becomes very complicated. You think of, people ask about prescribed fire, like, why don't you use it more? And well, when there's homes built right on in a location and a fashion where you essentially are really kind of handcuffed to use that prescribed fire tool, because it will impact homeowners and landowners on the boundaries. And there's no more kind of a stark example of like, oh wow, how would these different rights, both of private property and federal property, kind of mix together and create a complex landscape? It's all where you and I live. It's
right.
It's up and down this Front Range.
Right, exactly. So I'm going to ask you because it's one of the things that's been interesting to me when we've talked about this already a little bit, is, so federal land, like we all have, different people have different assumptions about what you can do on that land, right? I can go and I can camp on it. I can go and I can hike on it, or, I can take some wood from it, or, oh no, it's this kind of land, so I've got to pay so I can do X, Y, and Z, but I can't take these things. And yet there's, whole segments of the population who think they just have they have personal rights to that land. And I think the stories that you've talked about your own personal experience with that, especially, with the family, the Bundy family, who has, had various sort of flare-ups with, say, with the federal government in Nevada and Utah and in Oregon, but just your experience as an individual working for the Forest Service, what that has looked like. I thought that was really interesting, like kind of how you had to think about land sort of differently through that experience.
Yeah. I've had so I started out as what we call a seasonal employee. And I was a firefighter for a long time. It was my summer job while I was going to school and grad school. And from my perspective, I loved these landscapes, and I wanted I was literally willing to risk my life to try to put out a forest fire to do what I thought was like the best job at the time. And I remember being on when these I started realizing there were different perspectives on these landscapes, and we discussed one with the Bundy family, and there was a series of pipe bombs that were put in Forest Service gates, where they have these metal cylinders that you gate locks are put under to keep them out of the elements and to keep someone from just kind of getting bolt cutters in there. They were booby trapping those, or there were booby traps for a while. I can't say, I don't know if there were convictions of it, so I can't say exactly who did it, but my introduction for a while, for a couple of summers, we had to get on hands and knees and look up into these cylinders to make sure they weren't booby trapped. And to me, I was like, that was a pretty stark reminder of not everybody's excited about these public lands and thinks them the same way. I remember the other big one was I worked on a hotshot crew in Idaho, in southern Idaho. And, being a firefighter, like we're experiencing with these big fires, the communities usually love you. When you come rolling in and their community is under threat and you kind of roll in your vehicles to we're here to help. I always had like wonderful, people were like, great, glad to see you. And I just remember we were traveling to a new assignment and was being informed by my boss, like, oh, we have to drive around this small little community. They don't like any Forest Service vehicles. They don't like us. We literally would drive, and our vehicles had big things like, we're a fire crew, on painted on the side. And I'm like, people love us. What are you talking about? Biker gangs gave us thumbs up, I didn't like, wow, that's, they had a different perspective of, hey, the federal government and the federal lands might restrict some of the activities that they want to do on these landscapes that they might be getting their livelihood. It might be related to grazing or some other kind of extraction, or they need different resources off there for a different reason that me being a kid raised in some suburbs hadn't really experienced before. And oh gosh, it was a real kind of education to, there's a lot of different perspectives out there, and a lot of different interactions to where, a friend of mine's a scholar that studied a lot of the Great Basin and some of the Bundys and some of these older families that really see themselves as like, hey, our family predates settlement of the creation of these public lands. So we feel that we, are kind of being grounded in this land precedes the federal presence here and therefore should supersede it. And that's a perspective, and I it's interesting to hear that and kind of realize, wow, that there is two sides to every flat pancake, as they say.
Right. Yeah, and that's, again, like when I think back that that the signs that say what they say, that they can be so simple, and yet these were. I realized that as I started doing it, that these were sort of the things I started kind of digging more into, or just sort of asking about and wondering about. That again, like the perspective that I had in some ways was really, it was very much sort of framed by, growing up in suburban DC to a federal government worker, and sort of a perception about what that, like how you preserve and you conserve that land, but that other people have completely different ideas about access to it and their rights to it and whatnot, that I may or may not agree with, but that's fine. But that these things can sort of, that the project sort of, rather than sort of pointing about what you can or can't do, or what is right and what is wrong, it's more just sort of opening up the opportunity to ask the questions about those spaces. not just take them for granted.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I love. That's one thing I really like about the Forest Service mission is it's a multiple use mission, meaning that there's all kinds of things you can do on national forests. We don't generally advertise this on a big sign that the 1872 Mining Act is still the law of the land, and you can patent a mining claim on a national forest. You can extract things off of national forests that might supplement your livelihood. They may, and that could be anything from hunting to guiding a recreational group to harvesting timber, or just harvesting a holiday tree.
Right.
In December. And it's fascinating because as an agency, we try to be a middle ground to where we try to welcome all these people and just try to let's all use these things judiciously so that your kids, your grandkids can do the same thing you're doing right now. And so being in the middle sometimes is an uncomfortable space. But it's actually a really fun space of opportunity because you get to help groups that sometimes don't see how much their interests are intertwined or relate to one another. And if you can get them to kind of sit together and realize, we like the same thing, we just like doing a little bit different things around it, but we have this common love of this landscape, and that's really fun.
Right. And then I also remember early on we were also talking about how when you first learned of the project, you were like, "Oh, I want to show this to the lawyers, to the lawyers in the Forest Service." And I'm kind of, have you done that? Have you shown it to them?
I haven't sent it yet. I gotta send. I kept thinking. Well, I kept thinking I would see him personally. That's how 2019 my brain still is. Right. So I just need to send it to this group and let them know, because they do exactly what these land attorneys, Department of Agriculture attorneys that teach Forest Service and different federal land managers how this concept of land law and land rights. And they talk about they use an illustration of a bundle of sticks where there's all those signs you have: the management rights, exclusion, alienation, extraction, access. Those are different sticks that you can break one of those sticks, but if they're tied together in a bundle, it's kind of this big bundle that won't break. Basically, you can't sever those. And they're going to get a huge kick out of this because they're trying to get that concept, and their illustrations are always really lame. And I never really liked the bundle of sticks kind of analogy or illustration. I'm kind of
right. Well, it's kind of hard. It's hard. You see a bunch of sticks, and then you're like, okay, but what do I do with these sticks?
Yeah, and I can break the bundle apart, right? And just start using them as kindling. That's
right. And I mean, I think, and again, it's it's really, when you think about federal, I mean, BLM land is like this too, because I think BLM land is like the largest holding of federal land. And then is it BLM and then Forest Service? Is that the order of? Yeah. Of sort of just acreage. But when you just think about it, I mean, the scale is it's hard to conceptualize it, And so when thinking sort of a bundle of sticks, they're so, in some ways, kind of small. And I mean, even if it's a big bundle of sticks, it's still a bundle of sticks. It's very portable, right? And I'm not saying that signs themselves somehow grasp the enormity of that land, but somehow putting them in the landscape sort of points to that enormity, or it points to the contradiction between the enormity of the land that you're looking at and the sort of the abstraction of this, of these rights, and then the thing that's being told to you, which on a sign, which seems very sort of concrete.
Yeah.
So hopefully the lawyers will will decide that will be there. It's not like a bundle of sticks. It's like a stack of signs.
Yeah. Look at this array. Look at this bright array of maybe we could do a new one of like a rainbow arch of these signs, maybe.
Right. I feel like I will have done something if the project sort of infiltrates into the federal government as some kind of use, infiltration for sort of some kind of didactic use in land management.
Yeah, well, it's a great. I mean, it's a great useful tool to that you've created. I think, and I apologize for calling your art a tool, but it's a great medium, I think, to help not only the public but people working on these landscapes to conceptualize, like, there's a lot going on when you really think about these landscapes. There's just this whole. I think, my personal opinion, when I teach or describe this idea of having public lands, that was a radical idea when our country did that. There was no country on the earth that had public lands. I mean, the closest we had were, the old, things like the British Empire, but those were crown lands. That was the possession of the king. Right. If you go back to Robin Hood, Robin Hood's always being chased out of Sherwood Forest because they're not supposed to be there.
Right.
That's the crown lands. And that concept of, we're going to reserve these lands, and there's going to be a whole bunch of different things that you can do. Like, some are so amazingly beautiful, like the Grand Canyon. Nobody touch it. No, nothing. Let's just build up some facilities to handle all the people that want to go look at it. Mm-hmm. And then there's others that, lands all the way to the, think of working lands on a national forest or the BLM where you have an active gold mine. Mm-hmm. Or this is a landscape we're going to let wild burros kind of have at it on this range and let them do their thing. And you're free to go dune buggy through there, but watch out for the red burros that you have to share the landscape with.
Right.
It's just to me, it's endlessly fascinating and richly complex. And that's what I love about your pieces and your art, is that not only are they tactile, but there's a rich complexity if you just think, start peeling back your layers, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing that's interesting is, like, when people talk about the land, well, it's public land, so I can make a decision about it. But that's also the reality. It's like, because we share it as a public, I personally cannot make, these decisions. And so sometimes I think that it's interesting when, and sometimes unfortunate when people, make those sort of proclamations about the land, that the very thing that gives us sort of the vastness of the public land doesn't mean, even though I'm a landowner, I can't just carve out my share and sell it. You know?
Yeah.
Which that seems obvious, but yet we hear people talk about that all the time, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Or an individual state. Individual states sometimes sue the federal government to say, we're suing for ownership and management of these federal lands within our state boundaries. We feel it's our state owns them and should manage them. That happens today. I mean, that's not a story from a long time ago. That's, within the last 5 years. Wow.
Incredible. So, I mean, I've enjoyed kind of rethinking this project. And like I said, it just, having grown up around among government workers and civil servants and really having a deep respect for kind of the civil service. Like I have lots of family members who they spent decades in doing that, but that was sort of growing up in that, but then kind of coming back to it in this way has kind of given me some perspective about the work that they've done. So I appreciate the work that you do as the current chief historian of the Forest Service.
Gosh, thanks. Well, thank you to all the artists. I mean, that's and educators. I mean, you're both, and the world needs more of that. We need that richness.
Yeah.
And enrichment.
Well, thanks.
Do we have questions, Yumi, or are we?
I thought we might be at the question point, perhaps.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't see any in the comments, but I think Sarah will.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, guys. I'll pop back in, and I've got some questions that our staff has been asking behind the scenes, and I'll also invite our folks who are watching from home to type in any questions that they may have in the chat as well. So I'll kick it off with some questions that I've got coming in from some of the staff of the MCA who are watching at home. And the first question is a question for Yumi, which is how has your project experience or changed the way that you personally experience public land?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think I go into public land all the time. It's hard not to in Colorado, right? If you're going anywhere that isn't urban, a lot of it, you go west, you're stumbling into public land. I think what it's done is it's made me think about public land again. And I haven't thought about it in those different ways. Like even just what Lincoln was saying, like, I think of the simple signs, for example, when you're in the Forest Service and they tell you, okay, you can hunt here, you can fish here, you can camp here, you can hike here. And those are visualizations of the things that you're allowed to do, but those refer to those kinds of rights. So, right, you can fish. That's a kind of, I'm guessing that's an extractive right. You're pulling resources, from the forest. You can camp, you can hike. Those are sort of access rights, things that you can do. So all of a sudden, the very things that I might have normally done on that land, I now think about, oh, well, this is this sort of thing, or this is this other sort of thing. So I think it's just, probably more self-awareness in those spaces.
Yeah. Was this project also a way to connect to your father and your growing up again as you were?
It became that. It didn't start there, but when I realized when I decided that I was going to kind of realize the project in the national forest, then it did. Then I was like, it sort of snapped that back into focus. And a lot of the conversations that he used to have when I was younger about the research that he was doing. And then the funny thing, again, I think I told this to Lincoln earlier, is that when he was doing the research for the Wilderness Act, he was actually coming to Colorado a lot. And actually the Denver Public Library they have a pretty large archive, I guess, on some of that history. So in his book, in the acknowledgments, there's a thanks to the Denver Public Library, which I think is kind of, serendipitous that I end up back here as a result. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
I know. It's funny how life takes us full circle sometimes. Question for you, Lincoln. You mentioned how signage for public land often tells us what we cannot do. Do you see this as a way to protect the land, or is this more, as Yumi said earlier, as a way to tell us how to be a good citizen and a good steward of our public properties?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Wow, that's a deeper question. A lot of times it's a lot of those signs are for kind of safety purposes, or is the primary one. A lot of the ones that say road closed, there's a good reason you shouldn't be on that. There's a safety concern, and then a lot of them, the other type, it's kind of telling you no, or that you can't do something, becomes a shorthand for a much longer conversation or ideas about this is how you could this is how we need to manage the use of this particular resource, whatever it may be. It may be like maybe a limit on the number of fish you can pull out, might be an example. Or you get a permit to take a tree off, but you have to get a permit for each individual kind of Christmas tree, or something of that kind of range, where you're it's trying to shorten the conversation of managed use, and oftentimes that goes into no.
No more of that. The answer is no. I was also struck by the similarities between each of you as you talked about your work. And Lincoln, you mentioned that you have been working for the Forest Service in various capacities since you were young. And Yumi, I suspect that you as well have been an artist since you were young. And I think it's interesting to have this conversation between the two of you, who are two people who found your calling, your vocation early in life and have stayed with it for so many years. And how does this work in your life? I guess is my question. Like, are you still fulfilled in this place that you started from?
I can answer first, and then Lincoln can answer, I guess. I think to me, it's kind of how I know to be. It's the way in which I can ask questions, and I can ask strange questions, and create work that, maybe it doesn't answer them, but it provides some opportunities for thought and reflection. So it gives me a lot of that license, which I think I've always wanted, and then I have to do the other things to get paid. But, but being able to do this stuff, I mean, especially, I've talked about it with other kinds of projects that I've been doing in this moment in particular too. It's, I've found it really liberating, in a time when we're really kind of like shut down, closed down. There are projects that I've been able to do that have really kind of rejuvenated the way in which I want to think about art, with the way I want to be as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I have the best job in the world. I mean, I'm like a history nerd in my bones. And, for a long time when I got interested in the Forest Service, I thought it was a mutually exclusive part of my life. It was my summer life, and then academics were my winter life. And then, some very smart professors I had kind of turned me on to, environmental history and how I could make those kind of two things I really loved the same, and brought them together, and like big giant light bulbs came on. I thought, aha, this is what I could do. And I'm really blessed. I get to do this job and feel very lucky, and love getting to do what I do. And even during, this pandemic, sometimes before the pandemic, sometimes you feel like, working in public lands, people forget about us. But it's been so wonderful to see that the public lands have been used so heavily actually during the pandemic, that, hey, this is, come out, enjoy, get out, you can find some socially distanced space, some wonderful things to do that are safe, and really seeing a big sort of explosion of use is really sort of makes a little public servant feel good that they're helping in some way to provide something like that, some relief for some people.
Yeah, I think that we're all grateful for the public lands during this time, and for all of the people who work there as well. And firefighters too. And that brings us to a question that we have from the audience. I'll bring this in on the screen. This is from Alejandra Abad, and she asks, how do the fires impact your stand on being neutral, on taking a side on these ethics of ownerships of the land and property?
Wow, that's a great question.
We have a smart audience.
Yeah, that's a great one. Fire's interesting. I mean, I have like my personal experience bleeds into this a lot. Like as a firefighter, we have a completely warped sense of what's good and bad. I mean, we all join into fire because we like fire and think it's an amazing change agent that, it's like, wow, we just want to see more of it happen. But I think it's one of those, your question it's such a complex, fundamental question where I think I've kind of gotten deeper a little bit into neutrality, because we think about, I understand the idea of why, people that live closer and closer to areas that are susceptible to wildfire, I get it. They're beautiful. I mean, it's really cool. And where do we stand as a country as Americans, we hate being told no for any reason.
Mhm.
And that really involves, particularly where you choose to live. I always think about the homes on the stilts on the beaches that are in those, regular hurricane paths out on the East Coast. And do people have a right to live there? And do they have a right to expect any kind of relief when pretty regular weather events can potentially take out those homes? It's a good question. I mean, as kind of like a historian and someone, my biggest goal is to inform people so that they're making an informed choice when they move to a place like the Front Range and decide, okay, I don't want to live down in the center of town. I want to live up on a ridge. My hope is I just try to inform them that, the risks that you take when you move up there are quite different from when you're living down in town. And, I'll let you make that decision, but if you're informed and know and are okay with the risks, okay. But if I would just want to let people and help people make an informed choice. They're not caught off guard by something like a terrible event like we had this summer around Boulder and Fort Collins, where hundreds of homes were lost. It's difficult. Like, I don't want to tell people no, but I hate to, you hate to see people lose their homes too. So best I can hope for is to really inform people so they really know what they're getting into.
And that, I think, is a perfect segue into our last question for tonight, which is, how can someone interested in protecting and preserving public lands become engaged?
Oh, wow. There's a lot of different ways they can get engaged just by becoming more informed. As a landowner, your land ownership of public lands is really represented by your elected officials and public representatives, and you can become informed by communicating with them. You're totally free to and encouraged to communicate with the local offices of the public lands around you, and contact them and say, you can ask questions about, how do I get involved in what you're planning on doing? Can I help? Can I argue against what you're planning on doing? All those things are really helpful because we are really trying to serve the local populations. And we can't do that if we don't know what people are valuing in those landscapes. So get involved and let your voice, let us hear your voice, basically.
And that has been the through line of so many of the programs that we've been fortunate enough to share with you tonight. I want to thank you, Lincoln. I want to thank you, Yumi, for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this conversation. Thanks for watching at home. We'll be back Wednesday, December 2nd with Alan Michelson. We'll be in conversation with Jolene Ricard. Thank you for tuning in, and good night.